it's an impressive disease. It can take quite a bit of yield. We've seen it big impacts on the grain side of things, and of course in Wisconsin, I really think the bigger impacts are actually in silage hybrids here, just because the pathogen can dry the hybrids down very quickly, and so trying to harvest at optimal moisture is really difficult, and then we get subsequent issues if we can't get good packing in the bunker silo. So there's some secondary impacts, including mycotoxins, which can come in. So the tar spot pathogen doesn't produce mycotoxins itself, but if you make poor silage, that allows for other pathogens to get in there and create problems.
Welcome to the Crop Science Podcast Show. My name is Brian Arnell, and I'm coming to you from the campus of Oklahoma State University. The Crop Science Podcast Show is brought to you on behalf of Wise and X. Today, I'm excited to have with us Dr. Damon Smith, who's a professor and extension specialist of field crops pathology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Damon's research interest is focused on biology, epidemiology management of field crop diseases, and also with a focus of developing and improving disease forecast systems that can be used accurately to advise fungicide applications. His extension efforts are focused on generating and evaluating, disseminating solutions to the many of the disease problems associated with field crops such as soybeans, corn, wheat, and alfalfa. Damon, I'm really happy to have you on the Crop Science Podcast Show. Please take a moment to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how you ended up at UW-Madison.
Yeah. I'm actually a first generation college kid with interest in agriculture, and I ended up in college with a plant physiology advisor, and the next thing I knew, I was at NC State doing graduate work in plant pathology. I'm kind of classically trained as a plant disease epidemiologist with a specialty in disease forecasting systems. So I've been doing disease forecasting work as well as management work and that sort of stuff for the last 20 years or so. Right out of graduate school, I went to Oklahoma State. I was there for about 5 years as the hort crops pathologist there, and then in 2012 I moved to the University of Wisconsin, got back into field crops. I'm the field crop pathologist here at UW, and we do a lot of work on disease forecasting as well as management, and I've been doing some work on some new diseases in corn.
Okay, so now jumping into the research. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the research you and your programs have been working on?
Yeah, we're really involved at the moment with the development of decision support systems, both in soybeans and corn. So we're doing a lot of work looking at how do we actually take mathematical models and move those out to the public so that they can use them in a format that's easy access and also accurate. So we actually have two decision support systems we've been running lately, spore casters for soybeans, a white mold disease, which is a big problem here in the upper Midwest, and then also tar spotter, which is for tar spot prediction in corn, and that's a new emerging disease here in the upper Midwest corn belt. So a lot of focus on that. We also have been doing quite a bit of work on mycotoxins actually in silage corn. So silage corn is a big deal, being the dairy state. We got a lot of acreage dedicated to silage here, 1 million or so acres. And mycotoxins, especially deoxynivalenol or vomitoxin, have been pretty considerable issues here. So we've been doing quite a bit of management work, trying to understand how do mycotoxins come in the field? How do we actually manage those, not only in the field, but then even during the ensiling process. So quite a bit of work there. And then I also have a small breeding program inside my pathology program for soybeans. So we're kind of focused on resistance to white mold, but we're also interested in other diseases as well. And so we do a lot of breeding for resistance there, trying to develop new germplasm that either could be licensed from the university or we do license a few of those direct to our Wisconsin Crop Improvement Association. So I got my fingers in quite a few areas related to disease management.
Yeah, definitely a diverse portfolio coming from your group there, Damien. I guess I'll jump in first. with one that I'm hearing the most in my region, and that's all about tar spot. So, for those that are not involved in corn production, give us a little bit of background because it is a newer issue, and that's really about all I'm hearing about. And it's a concern when the soil fertility specialist is getting asked about it because I'm the wrong person to be asking.
Yeah, so fairly new disease. It's considered a tropical or subtropical pathogen. So it's been known in Mexico and some of the Central American countries for, since about 1910, right? So they've been working on it quite some time. It got to the U.S. It was first identified in Indiana and Illinois about 2015. We saw it in Wisconsin in 2016. And then the first really substantial epidemic in the Midwest was 2018. That's where we really learned a lot. We saw some significant yield reductions in that year, and research really ramped up starting about 2018. Trying to understand management, hybrid resistance, how do fungicide applications factor into this sort of thing, and is this really the same pathosystem that's being even dealt with in Mexico and Central America. And since then, we've had a couple other seasons with some pretty substantial impacts. 2021 was a pretty important year here, and then we've had some isolated epidemics. 2022, and then 23 was, because it was hot and dry, not such a bad year, but it's definitely something that we see come in every year here in the Midwest. It just depends on where we get rain events and humidity and those sorts of things are really fired up. But it's an impressive disease. It can take quite a bit of yield. We've seen it big impacts on the grain side of things, and of course in Wisconsin, I really think the bigger impacts are actually in silage hybrids here, just because the pathogen can dry the hybrids down very quickly, and so trying to harvest at optimal moisture is really difficult, and then we get subsequent issues if we can't get good packing in the bunker silo. So there's some secondary impacts, including mycotoxins, which can come in. So the tar spot pathogen doesn't produce mycotoxins itself, but if you make poor silage, that allows for other pathogens to get in there and create problems.
So, what's different about tar spot when compared to some of the more traditional diseases we see in corn?
Yeah, good question. There's some things just fundamentally about its biology that are just a little bit different. We've been learning a little bit about this, and we recently published some work looking at some modeling, just trying to understand the weather impacts on the pathogen. And then there's been some others that kind of come behind us and do some control experiments to confirm what we were seeing. We sort of, as pathologists, we sort of have this thing in our mind where it has to be wet all the time. We have to have kind of moderate temperatures, and then we get disease. And if you look at sort of our more traditional foliar pathogens like gray leaf spot or corn leaf blight, those sorts of things sort of hold true, right? Tar spot's just different. It doesn't really hold true to that. It likes to come to find out, in our work and then some of the subsequent work that's been coming out more recently is that it really takes fluctuating wet dry cycles actually to really fire this thing up, which is a little bit different than if we look at corn leaf blight, which has to have high relative humidity, wet conditions, those sorts of things. Just kind of
I always think greenhouse, right? But if I'm in a greenhouse, I have humidity, and the tar spot's just been.
Yeah, it's just different, and we sort of get 2021 was a good year of this in the Midwest because we got really hot and dry. So we had a little bit of rain May, June. July got really hot for us, and folks got kind of complacent and just sort of forgot in tar spot it started, but the hot conditions didn't shut it down. And the minute we turned rainy and cool again in August, it was game over for us, right? And so anecdotally, we sort of were seeing it, but it was really interesting to start seeing it as we were looking at our modeling efforts. And then, some others had done some control experiments where they demonstrated, yes, you have to have wetness at first, and then you have to withhold that. So it's really interesting. It just sort of breaks the rules, and it's a little different. And then the other thing about it is it has a very long, what we call incubation and latent period. So from the time that it actually infects the plant to when you actually see the first, signs of the tar spots, it can be as long as 3 weeks for that process to happen. And then it can be as much as 40 days before you really start to get what we call secondary cycles. And so from a management standpoint, yeah, that's really frustrating, right? Because by the time you actually see it, if you're trying to rely solely on scouting, you're almost way too far. Yeah, yeah. So it's just really a challenge, but from a research standpoint, it fits really well for a forecasting system, right? Something that we can sort of look into that crystal ball and say, hey, have the conditions been conducive? Combine that with some scouting, and then try to get ahead of it, with in-season management.
So, as far as control, and of course, you're looking at the disease triangle, but is there a genetic by fungicide or is it only fungicide? Where are we as far as our control options?
Yeah, so the 2018-21 epidemics, we were really kind of leaning really hard on the fungicide applications, and there was quite a bit of work, just looking at both product choices and timing. At the same time, the companies were starting to screen hybrids, and we actually worked with Michigan State and also the University of Illinois, some breeders there, to actually look at breeding germplasm. So there is some tropical material which has really, really good resistance, but it's been slow to try to introgress the resistance, of course, into hybrids that we can grow in the Midwest. So we lean really hard on the fungicides until the genetics could sort of catch up. We are seeing now, we're seeing some decent resistance in some of the commercial hybrids now, so that's good, and we kind of know the lay of the land in terms of some of those hybrids. We've got good work to show, resistance really plays an important role in the management side. The fungicide thing is actually have lots of products, really. Product choice isn't the problem. It's really more about timing, and that timing can move around depending on the season. And really, it's when do those wet dry cycles sort of line up relative to when do we have tasseling, and that's really the important piece. Does the triangle sort of line up before tassel, or does the triangle line up after tassel, right? So if it's before tassel, those can be really impactful years in terms of yield reduction with this disease. But if it lines up after, like 2023, we had some show up, but it was so late in August that the plants had already beat the fungus to the finish, right? And so in a year like that, fungicides weren't really needed. But if you look at 2021, we actually had to put two applications on that year to control it. So it can move around a little bit, and that's what makes it a little bit frustrating. Just trying to really get that timing piece down so that you can really reap the entire benefits of that product.
So, I guess this is a two-pronged question. Is really fascinating to me. First, I guess I'll go with origination. So we expect that it came out of Mexico. We have the similar traits and characteristics, but we know how did it move north into non-tropical areas? Was there a progression? Did the pathologist watch this thing move its way north from Mexico? I mean, because really, Mexico and Wisconsin, they aren't really side by side. So were you able to track it north, or did it just magically appear in the Corn Belt?
Yeah, so there's great debate on how the pathogen got here, and so there's sort of two schools of thought. One is that so there was a hurricane or tropical storm event that kind of came up across Mexico and then went up the Mississippi River Valley, and so there's some thought that that's how the inoculum was picked up in Mexico and then deposited in the Midwest. The sort of from an epidemiology standpoint, the only flaw in that concept for me is that if that were the case, every time we had a rain event that was associated with that system, we should have seen a plume of disease, right, up through there. And instead, what was actually observed were isolated fields in both Indiana and Illinois. So these were sort of, what that tells us is those were point source epidemics, or point source initiation of epidemics. And so the second school of thought is that, well, there was perhaps some residue introduced, right? So how that happened, there's and and
Yeah, nobody's really going to take that bullet.
yeah, exactly. So I think it was probably somehow introduced inadvertently. Nobody probably, I'm sure nobody did it on purpose. It just sort of had happened, and since the introductions, it's interesting. You can look at, we have some time lapse maps, and you can actually see it radiating out from those point source epidemics. So it continues to expand every year. We see new acreage in the Midwest. We're also seeing now some point source initiations of epidemics on the East Coast. Florida has dealt with it for some time. About the same time we saw it, Florida actually had, in their sweet corn production systems there. So it's just continues to expand. We do consider it now in the Midwest. It's an established pathogen. We have inoculum here; it can overwinter. So we have epidemics every year. It's just where does the triangle line up in terms of?
That's really my follow up was the inoculum. So are we looking at the inoculum left on the residue, or is it can it be hosted by any of the weed species, like it's coming out of the bar ditch, or is it just on that residue?
Yeah, good question. So there is other tar spot species that go to some of our, for lack of a better term, ditch grasses. So you can go out and look for those and see it. We were part of some work, some collaborative work with the USDA scientists, where we looked at species there, and it's from what we can tell, the species that goes to corn is isolated to corn, right? So we don't need to worry about those other pathogens that are on, some of these weed species and that sort of thing. So that brings us then to how does the corn specific pathogen then overwinter? It overwinters on corn residue. So we tend to see corn on corn no-till systems having a little higher inoculum potential there. Although we did do some work in terms of rotations and tillage here. We're big no-tillers here in the Midwest, and so I'd rather not see people abandon no-till to manage this, because we only see a small incremental drop in terms of residue management. So you do have some infield initiation of the epidemics, but the spores can still move, right? And we've got enough corn in the Midwest that it's just sort of, you have enough inoculum around to initiate the epidemic. So it just really comes down to, if you think about the triangle, you've got the host, you got the pathogen. The weather is what really drives this now for us in terms of severity.
Well, fascinating conversation on tar spot with Dr. Damon Smith, professor and extension specialist, University of Wisconsin. I want to shift our conversation a little bit, stay in a primary crop, which you still work, as you do also work in soybeans. So not only did you mention that you're working with white mold in soybean, but also doing some breeding work on your side. So you're really stretching out there with the breeding. So tell us a little bit about some of the challenges farmers in your region have with pathogens, and what are the other primary diseases that they have to deal with? I'm assuming white mold is a big one.
Yeah, white mold caused by Sclerotinia sclerotiarum seems to be the one. It's not our most yield limiting pathogen. Soybean cyst nematode is still our number one yield reducer, but we have genetics that we can manage that with. We do have some seed treatments that we can help manage it. The thing about white mold is that, while it's number two to soybean cyst nematode, it's so hit and miss on where you're going to see it. It's very weather driven. We have, again, if you think about the triangle, we have lots of soybeans here in the state. We have plenty of inoculum, so it really is up to the weather side of that to really push this. And so, that system was another great candidate to develop a disease forecasting system. So we spent quite a bit of time developing some models there to predict when we would have. There's a small mushroom-like structure that has to form that releases the spores. And so we did a lot of work modeling the development of that mushroom-like structure so that we could really understand when do the spore flights actually happen, right? And that would help us better time in-season fungicide applications, because our genetics here, we have some resistance, some partial resistance in the commercial germplasm, but we push so hard for yield, and then we've seen so many herbicide trait releases lately that we always are playing catch up in terms of trying to keep the disease resistance up there. And so we really rely really heavily on the fungicide applications here to really manage this.
So you work a lot in the forecasting aspect. Where are you and your stakeholders pulling the weather data from? What are your weather sources, as I'm assuming that's a primary driver of your forecasting? And as a side note, I think it's fascinating. I tell folks that how amazing I could be as far as the nutrient recommendations I make if I knew the forecast ahead of, a 30-day forecast. kind of like you, I can only imagine if you had a solid 30-day forecast, the predictions would be really spot on and really out of this world, right?
Right, right, yeah. Yeah, we're not quite there yet, but we're working towards that. Yeah, it's interesting, being in this field for 20 years or so. I started doing forecasting work as a graduate student. The where the weather data came from was always the big piece, right? We knew, from a biology and epidemiology standpoint, a lot of times, what weather pieces were really important, but it was actually measuring that and pulling that down in real time. And so traditionally, we were really stuck hard on, pulling data from hardwired weather stations and that sort of thing. And, when I was at Oklahoma State, Oklahoma has a great mesonet system. And I learned a lot from those folks down in Norman, just about how difficult it is to maintain a weather station, infrastructure and accuracy, instrumentation, and all those sorts of things. So when I moved to Wisconsin, we didn't have a mesonet. So I was sort of stuck at that time trying to figure out, all right, how am I actually going to move these models to the mainstream? And so we started looking at gridded interpolated data systems. Early on, we were using a system called Dark Sky, and Dark Sky was on, I think at that time, they might have been on 10-kilometer grids. I can't quite remember where we were at, but it worked pretty good. But then they got bought by Apple, and so we sort of got left hanging there a little bit. And so we made a shift, and now we're using IBM 4-kilometer historical gridded weather data to pull down to our phone. So it hits a GPS coordinate, goes up to the cloud, it grabs that weather information, then pulls it down. The key piece is that for all of our models, we use that same weather system to develop the models, so that when we actually implement the models, we're using the same weather. And that's really been an important piece in this. So, and we're seeing these weather sources really improving quite a bit. And there's been a lot of discussion here. I work with a group called the Data Science Institute here at Wisconsin. And, we're looking at even finer gridded systems and that sort of thing. But what that does for us is it helps, especially for farmers who have, 2, 3, or 4,000 acres and they're trying to make decisions across that acreage. You can't have a weather station, right? So, it's a good alternative. While we would still love to have measured weather data, and now we do have a mesonet in Wisconsin, we're working with those folks. I think, the way forward, especially in the large field crop systems, is going to be these gridded networks. And, as far as forecast, that's been a struggle. We do deploy a true 7-day forecast, but man, we see that fluctuate wildly, even 7 days. But it is useful 3 to 4 days out. We have some farmers watch those forecasts and make some decisions trying to get ahead of some of the weather events that'll be coming at them.
You spend enough time in Oklahoma and you learn not to trust forecast even a couple days out. But in the last couple minutes, I'm absolutely curious. And so I'm glad we have a few moments. How does a pathologist, epidemiologist add being a breeder onto that list? I mean, that's a whole nother realm of complication into an already diverse portfolio in your research program.
Yeah, so the breeding thing was planted early on. So when I was a master's student, one of my co-advisors was a breeder, and he got me really interested in just, how do pathogens interact at sort of the molecular level, right? And so I've always had an interest there. And later on in my career, I took that interest and actually moved that into my forecasting work. So we actually published a paper pretty recently with a former student of mine where we actually offset our modeling based on the known resistance in some of the soybean varieties, right? So we can't, in my opinion, this isn't all just in a vacuum. The host and the pathogen all influence the triangle, right? And so trying to understand how can we actually incorporate that into our forecasting systems has been really interesting. And I have a colleague upstairs, he's just very interested in host parasite interactions, and he sort of sucked me in. And so we have some interesting conversations over a beer, geeking out about how do pathogens affect plants. So it's just been It's just been always an interest of mine, and I've always hung on to it, even though it might not be the absolute, primary piece of research in my program.
No, I agree. But that across discipline, especially now, I mean, if we look at academia 20 years ago, all the land grant departments had four pathologists, four entomologists, four weed scientists, four fertility specialists, four cropping system specialists. Everybody really had their own little lanes they worked in, and they got really specialized. And they were able to hammer out some really amazing research. Now, I don't know about UOW, but where we're at OSU, we're not that way anymore. We're no longer really able to specialize, especially in extension, right? I mean, where extension specialists tend to be a little bit more of jack of all trades and master of none when it comes to our need to be able to answer questions and answer questions on the go. And I really respect anyone who reaches out and does something unique. I had a lot of engineers in my background, so I tend to tinker a lot with a lot of engineering stuff, whether it's on the electrical or mechanical side. I mean, it to me, it seems to build a much more impactful program, and so I greatly respect what you're doing there and acknowledge it's a needed, it's a necessity, and really a diverse program helps extension should be done that way.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's we're the same way here. We're sort of jacks of all trades and masters of none. But we still are able to kind of dig in. And I think the key is you surround yourself with good people, right? You find students with similar interests, and you make sure that you give them a chance. And I have some really talented scientists around me as well, and so it's been fun, even though it's been a lot of things, and it's a diverse portfolio, if you will. It's been fun working with all those folks.
Well, I think we're going to have to bring you on another time to dive into that forage conversation. In fact, on a grant with some of your cohorts up there at UW. Brian Luck is one. We're doing an alfalfa grant together, looking at the impact of controlled traffic on alfalfa fields. So I want to know more about what you're doing on the forage realm, and we should look at it, arranging another time together.
It's time for our famous three.
With that, I'd like to wrap up our discussion with the three questions I always ask my guest. First, what is your go-to work resource?
I don't know. I think it's the people around here. I just when I need something, or need to kick an idea around or whatever, I go find. I have great colleagues in this department. We're still a dedicated plant pathology department here, so there's 14 or 15 of us faculty. We're a small department, but we actually have the most extension FTE here. So I go find those people and really lean on them and have conversations. Go to lunch with them, have a coffee. I think the networking piece is still really important. And unfortunately, the time commitments anymore. I think push in on that sometimes and are sort of counter to that. And I'm trying to make sure I carve out some time for my colleagues, because that's where the ideas and the research come from.
Absolutely. Second, what's your favorite leisurely activity you do on your free time?
Yeah, I'm an avid bicyclist. I've been in all the different bicycle disciplines over the last 30 years or so, on and off. And so I bicycle commute to work. I ride gravel and road bikes, and my son and I like to ride mountain bikes together. So whenever I can, I try to either get out in the woods, ride, or do a road ride or a gravel ride.
Well, I think you need to make a trip back to Stillwater sometime when they're doing the Red Dirt 100. It's 100 mile dirt road bike ride, and depending on weather, it can get really interesting. If you know these red dirt roads down here, it can be it can turn into an adventure quickly.
Yeah, I bet. I actually do follow that on social media. So gotta follow along. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, they have some good years and they have some rough years. We'll just leave it at that. Finally, Damien, where do people go to find out more about your work and your program's work?
Yeah, so probably the best resource is badgercropdoc.com. So it's all one word, and .com. And then I'm active on social media, including X, so badgercropdoc on X. And then I am making my way in some of the other platforms like Instagram, so you can find me there as well, Badger Crop Doc. So those are probably the best places to look, and then you can find our papers and link over to some of the other efforts that I'm part of. So Crop Protection Network is another great resource out there that has a lot of disease, insect, and weed information on it. So I'm pretty active in that group as well.
Damien, thanks so much for joining me today. We've had the pleasure of visiting with Dr. Damon Smith, who's a professor and extension specialist of field crops pathology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Folks, if you enjoyed what you've heard today, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you get notifications when we have a new podcast released. Make sure you share it with your friends and anybody you think would enjoy listening and learning more about the world of crop science, whether it's the soil, crop, or the environmental side of it. If you have any comments or suggestions for who we should have next, feel free to reach out. Dr. Smith, thank you so much for joining us today. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was great.